Hello guys, and welcome back to episode 2 of this Q&A series, where today's question comes from Reddit from the user Cavaclaw, and he asks, Vikings or Liberators versus Protoss with Colossus? And he says, Hi guys, in HOTS, Vikings were the obvious counter to Colossus. Now I see more pro players just getting Liberators and sieging the Protoss player out on the map. Since Liberators are also used for harass throughout, and can eventually be part of the main army and do devastating ground damage, do you really even need the Vikings? I would think you would really only start building Vikings if you went mass Colossus. Really, I'm asking what to prioritize after my first 4 medevacs. I didn't include a replay because it's more of a general question about the meta. I hope that's okay. Thanks. Camo Clock obviously asks a pretty interesting question, and I think the question is pretty much only one topic, which is basically, do you build Vikings against Colossus? And if so, how many Colossus do we really need to play against before we start making Vikings? I will expand the question a little bit, and we will talk a tiny bit about why do we get Vikings over Liberators? I guess that's actually part of the question. And also, what do we do after our first 4 medevacs? And this is where it can vary a bit from player to player and who your opponent is. But at least we can take a general look at some of the pro games and just kind of see their approach. And we can at least try and make some assumptions about when the best time to switch really is. First off, the reason why Vikings are quote-unquote better than Liberators against Colossus is because Colossus have more range than Liberators, even when you have range. And especially when you have no ranged Liberators, which is kind of hard to have early on because it's very expensive, you don't really have a good way to fight the Colossus and to kill them in battles. Because good Protoss can always just kind of put up the Colossus, do the AoE damage on hold position, and they don't really need to go into the Liberators. And when they are defending a low amount of bases, as they usually are early on, 2 bases, 3 bases, it really is quite hard to outposition them. Because the whole Protoss game plan is to have vision and keep track of where you are. So while you might get in with Liberators and get a really good siege on the Nexus on 4 bases or 5 bases, on 2 and 3 bases, it really doesn't happen that often. And if you can't actually siege somewhere important where you're shooting at their critical infrastructure or economy, then they can always just poke and they never really have to fight you. And what ends up happening is just you can't push into them. You just sit there and you look pretty. And that's probably the main reason why you generally don't go Liberators against Colossus. It's not that they're inherently bad, it's just that you have no way to force the engagement other than moving your bio forward, in which case you then have to fly in your Liberators and siege them while they're getting shot at, and it's not fantastic. One of the things though that makes Liberators somewhat okay is if you have very high supply and you can defend your own bases with Liberators, it's really hard for Protoss to attack into them as well, so you can set up some base traits. But generally that tends to happen a little bit later on in the game when you have higher economies, when you have Liberator range, when you have bigger army supplies. And it's never forbidden to make Liberators against Colossus, you just kind of want your Viking cloud first to be able to fight them and force fights. And then you can eventually start adding on Liberators as the game go on and you have more army supply to work with as well. If you then consider when should we actually start making Liberators over Vikings, how many Colossus are we talking? And at that point you have to delve into what is the current meta, and this is the kind of answer that will change over time as strategies change and the meta changes. Right now, the most common way for pros to play is they go up to about 3 Colossus. Sometimes they go 4, sometimes they go 2, but around 3 Colossus. And then they start going Disruptors, because eventually Colossus kind of falls off as the upgrades get higher, as the supplies get really high, as you have a lot of Starport units on the Terran side. Colossus does fall off, but it's used as a shield to take the 3rd base and a shield to get up more tech. So with that number in mind, you can kind of stop somewhere between like 6 and 10 Vikings, depending on how much you want to force a fight. If you're trying to do a push, you want to be closer to 10. If you're trying to just expand and maybe do some drops, maybe do some hidden runs, you would maybe get away with somewhere around, maybe 6 is a little bit low, maybe like 8. So somewhere between 8 and 10 against 3 Colossus. Depends a little bit on how much you want to try and actually kill them. If you play against people that have more than 3 Colossus, you would generally want a lot more Vikings, and you would never really make Liberators. So I think you bring, like, Cavaclaw brings up a good point, right? It's like, if there are mass Colossus, we don't want Liberators, and that's true enough, because we don't have a way to fight them. Also, when the Colossus number gets higher, it is exponentially harder for your bio to engage the Colossus, because the more Colossus there are, the more they just kind of shrek all the bio that comes into range. It turns into this, like, field of death. Where if it's a low number of Colossus, bio can still kind of be in range and fight and do reasonably okay, as long as you are not, like, all Marines. I do think when you play against the free Colossus style, though, generally once you get past the decent amount of Vikings you want, we said like 8 to 10, you would mostly start making Liberators. And it also has a lot to do with the Liberators are very good against the transition out of Colossus, which in the European meta, it's mostly Disruptors. In the Korean and North American meta, it's a little bit more Templars, but the Liberators obviously both against both those types of transitions. So following up with Liberators after you have your Viking core always is a good thing. There are specific scenarios when people will stay on Colossus, even if it's just like 3 and 4, and then they'll mass up Blink Stalkers, in which case you might actually want to avoid getting the Liberators too fast, just because the power of the Colossus armies versus Liberators is they can always poke, and they can just avoid the zones and don't really fight you, so they take pop shots at you and just backs off, and they're efficient that way. But I think that's the only scenario where, even if they don't make more Colossus or don't transition, that you might not want to get the Liberators. So specifically the very heavy Stalker armies that just retains like 3, maybe 4 Colossus in those cases. If we then think about the part of the question that asks, or that mentions that Liberators can be used for harass, and maybe should make them because of that, that is true enough. Liberator harass is still, I would say, okay. It used to be way better. Now, especially without Liberator range, it really is just okay. You might get in some harassment if you do a multi-pronged attack, but generally you would only make 1, maybe 2 Liberators in coordination with some type of other attack to try and do some harassment. But just making them in a standard macro game where you have more economy and more production, I really don't think the Liberator harass is that great. And you have to keep in mind as well, and this is kind of an important concept when you talk about what you're making, is yes, you can use them for harass. You can also use bio with drops for harass. But when you play against Protoss as Terran, a lot of the game revolves around timing attacks. You want to hit either late on the 3rd base or early on the 4th base. And when you do those kind of timing attacks, one of the very large bottlenecks in Terran infrastructure is the starport. Because we get the starport a little bit later, we generally only get 1 unless we're playing more of a passive game that doesn't plan to attack. But for the most part, everyone who tries to finish the game on 3 or 4 bases, you only have 1 starport, and all the units you make out of that starport are really, really important. You want to keep the starport active all the time, and you want to not bleed off units because it hampers your production. So if you think about a typical Terran army that pushes on 4 base, like 180 supply, round end, right? You have 46 medevacs, 8 to 10 Vikings, and then you might start reinforcing with some Liberators. So if you are making Liberators for harassment instead, what ends up happening is you might have the 6 medevacs still, and then you might have, let's say, 5 Liberators because you lost 3 or 4 to harassment, right? Then your army doesn't really kill his army, and that kind of has to be your ultimate goal when you construct your army. It's not, I want to kill probes and probes and probes. Well, at some point you have to kill the army. So as much as you can use them for harassment, and that's great, you want to be careful that you don't just make all the harassment units from the starport and bleed them off, because then you don't have anything to actually fight the army later on. I will say though, as a final note on that topic, is that Liberators are a little bit safer at home. So if a Protoss is planning to do a really hardcore timing, then having the Liberators makes you a lot safer than the Vikings. But then you really have to settle in for playing a very long game against very high economy and very high tech Protoss. And if that's your thing, okay, just keep in mind, or just be aware, that if you are making the Liberators, then you're kind of settling in for the long haul. And on maps where your bases are very open, like if you think about Newkirk Precinct, where there's a lot of angles to attack you, then it might just be too hard. It's up to you. You can definitely experiment with it. But you have to understand that when you are making the Liberators, you're saying, I'm not planning to attack you. The last part of the question is, how do I know what to make after my first 4 medevacs? And that's when you can definitely make some decision based on what you scout, and that requires a lot of experience, and it's very situational. So because there was no replays, we just won't talk too much about all the different scenarios or particular scenarios that you have encountered. But I will say, if you study pro games, their general trend is they go 4, but more often 6 medevacs, and then if they see Colossus, they make Vikings. If they don't see Colossus, they start making 2 Liberators, and then if they find out it's Colossus, they go Vikings. If they don't see anything, they obviously just keep making Liberators, because the Liberators are kind of what you want against everything but Colossus. So, as a general rule of thumb, and as a good ground rule, go to 6 medevacs. If you don't see Colossus, go Liberators, and if you see Colossus, go Vikings. It's not perfect, and it obviously does vary a little bit on how aggressive your playstyle is and what kind of openers you have been in, but I just think it's a good starting point, and then you can always refine your build from there if you want to trim the medevac count, or if you want more medevacs, or if you just want to blindly always go Liberators and play defensive, or always make Vikings and just land them and have them be like second tier bio units. I hope that answered your question, Clock. If you would like more detail about specific games, depending on the scouting info, post a replay and we can always look at that. And for anyone else that might have questions, I mostly pull them off of Reddit right now, but if you do have one that you would like me to take a look at, you can tag me on Reddit or any of the social media really, and I'm sure that the nice sites will tell me that someone wants to talk to me. So thanks for watching, guys, and I will see you in the next one.